I want to start with you zeroing in on a little bit of what we just heard from President Trump. This sort of the fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. What do you think when you hear this conflict framed in those words by the American president?
I think that when you hear those kinds of words from President Trump, he's not speaking to a foreign audience. He's speaking to a domestic audience. This is the primacy of domestic politics. So that when he speaks about threats from the outside, he's actually trying to push buttons with a domestic constituency, whether it's one that's against immigration, whether it's one that has fears about different social groups who may be in decline, or economic threats. So that's what I hear underlying this threat about the clash of civilizations, if you will.
Lawrence, just out of curiosity, when we see Trump in Poland talking about whether the West will survive, where do you think that places Russia in that mentality?
Well, I think what he's trying to do is make up for the fact that when he spoke to the NATO heads of state a couple of weeks ago, he didn't mention Article 5. In fact, it was in his speech, and it was taken out by people like Steve Bannon on his staff. So I think he reiterated that today, and also said that, you know, the West is going to draw a firm line with NATO, not just Poland, which is right on the frontier with Russia, and then, of course, with the Baltic. So I think he was trying to say, look, we're ready to go, and we're not going to let you undermine us either militarily or psychologically, or even, you know, using cyber weapons.
On that note you just mentioned, Cameron, hearing Trump coming out, reinforcing mutual defense, something he seemed to be very deliberately not doing back in May in that first meeting with NATO leaders. Why the shift now, and do you think NATO should be reassured or doubtful?
Well, I think that it's necessary for the president to make that kind of statement, especially in Poland. Poland is the country that was so concerned in the past about deals being made over its head, so-called about us, without us deals, where the Americans and the Russians would talk without Poland at the table. So I think it was partly a necessity that if he's going to speak to a Polish audience, he has to be sympathetic to that. Nonetheless, I think it also does represent a certain element of power that has kind of grown among the advisors to Trump, perhaps representing the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense, who have consistently, despite other less focused statements by the president, maintained that the United States is committed to Article 5 and that it takes NATO very, very seriously as a mutual defense organization.
Lawrence, another thing that these countries in the G20 tomorrow are likely pushing for, as you sort of pointed to, is for Trump to put some pressure on Russia, whether it's about Crimea or meddling in both American and allegedly European elections. Is that wishful thinking on their part?
No, I don't think so. I think the fact that Trump, who seemed to not pay attention to this at first, or, you know, talk in glowing terms about Putin, if he's willing to lay it on the line with Putin, I think that will have more resonance, because the Russians may be under the delusion, oh, we can do anything we want because Trump is on our side. So I think, and some of the things he said in the speech today about Russia say, as the ambassador pointed out, that people like General McMaster and Secretary Mattis are telling him what he needs to do in dealing with Russia.
Cameron, the G20, if we're sort of to look at the bigger picture of this organization, was started with an eye towards better global cooperation. Looking at where we are at now, whether it's Trump, Russia, Europe, do you think that global cooperation has actually gotten better, or quite the opposite?
Well, it all depends on what you expect to be the goal of that global cooperation. If the traditional goals of transnational issues like proliferation or climate change or other issues that aren't basically covered by the traditional bilateral diplomacy, if that's what you're looking for, I think you're going to be disappointed. And that was, in fact, when the G20 was formed, what most people anticipated. What we're seeing now is a kind of a transformation. There is international cooperation. We'll see the leaders of the world come to some sorts of agreements, but it's going to be on a very different tenure, a very different flavor of international agreements that'll take place, that'll be focused on interests more than on values, focused on the actions, if President Trump is to be believed, rather than words. And we'll just see whether this kind of diplomacy is the diplomacy going forward. So no, I wouldn't say it's the end of cooperation. It'll be a very different kind of cooperation in the years to come.
Gentlemen, and while we're talking, let's pull up some of these live images from Hamburg, Germany. That's, of course, the setting of the G20 set to get underway tomorrow. We already see a scene of some protests, a few protests in that shot, just about a dozen or so, but quite a few riot police. Clearly, they are prepared and expecting this kind of interaction to potentially happen at that also potentially very volatile meeting when we see tomorrow at the G20 with all of those issues on the table. While we're looking at those images, Lawrence, does that, you know, you might not be seeing it, but we're seeing a sort of a very active and aggressive-looking scene in the streets of Hamburg. Does that tell you anything about the atmosphere in which these leaders are wading into this meeting?
Well, I think it says that a lot of Europeans are very disappointed in Trump. He got out of the climate change agreement, for example. He was, you know, waffling on whether, you know, we would come to the support of NATO. His policy on refugees. I think what they're trying to say is, you know, we went all through this and we've moved beyond it, and we need your leadership to keep going. You're putting us backward, and I think that's what they're trying to say. And you're coming here, we're going to tell you exactly how we feel about some of the things you've done, just like we've had an awful lot of protests in the United States about some of Trump's policies about refugees and women and other issues like that.
All right, and just when we see that live shot panning out, I want to bring that up again. We see quite a few dozens, maybe hundreds of protesters out there in the streets, and even more riot police out prepared to deal with it. That is ahead of the G20 getting set for Hamburg, Germany tomorrow. That's also where President Trump and Vladimir Putin are set to have their very first formal face-to-face of the Trump presidency. Ambassador Cameron Munter in New York, Lawrence Korb in Washington, thanks very much for weighing in.